These guys were just a couple years older than you all when they put their lives on hold. Many have just graduated high school or were in college, but they put their lives on hold to join the war effort to do their part. But we have a distinguished panel of aviators here with us who served at different periods of the war and had different experiences. And we'll get to hear about some of those, and I hope you all will have a chance. We obviously can't cover all of their stories in detail, but I hope you have a chance to meet them after this and hear a bit more. But we'll start to my left with John Luckadoo, pilot from the 100th Bomb Group. Luckadoo flew during the most difficult period of the war, during a period where 70% of the guys he flew with were either killed in action or became prisoners of war. And Lucky has earned that nickname Lucky by being one of the lucky few that survived 25 missions. But Lucky, we've talked before about the things you were up against, the 4 Fs, as you like to say. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Matt, we discovered when we went over so early in the European War in June of 1943, without fighter escort, we were very apprehensive because we were citizen soldiers. We were not professionals, but we were going up against the world's most formidable air force, the Luftwaffe. And they had been fighting for 4 years. The Russians on the Eastern Front against the British on the Western, and they knew what the heck they were doing. We had no clue. And before we shipped out for overseas, our commander called us in and he said, look to your right and look to your left, look ahead of you and behind you, and only one of you is going to come home. As young and innocent and gullible as we were, going against this force, we discovered we had not one enemy, but 4, all of which began with the letter F. The first was fear, because we literally were scared to death about the unknown. The second was the fighters. The Germans were so well equipped, so experienced, and yet we were not. We were really ill-trained and ill-prepared for what we were confronting with. The third was the black. The Germans had perfected their anti-aircraft defenses to the nth degree. And although initially our commanders didn't think that they could reach us at the 25 to 29,000 feet that we were normally supposed to fly in our formations, their anti-aircraft could go to 30,000 feet without any trouble. And the last but not the least was the freezing cold that we had to endure because we were unpressurized. And we were flying with only a thin sheet of aluminum between us and the anti-aircraft and the outer elements. We were virtually flying on the fringes of outer space at 25,000 feet, trying to prove the strategy that our commanders insisted upon, and that was going out in broad daylight at high altitude, unpressurized, and supposedly with fighter escort. But I'm here to tell you that that seldom happened.
Thank you, Lucky. I'll turn to my right here. Lester Schrank. Lester, you flew with the 92nd Bomb Group as a ball turret gunner. If you've seen the B-17, it's the ball in the waist of the plane that rotates 360 degrees, which is a tight position to get into. But Lester, on your 10th mission, your crew was shot down over Denmark. You were one of the lucky few that escaped. What happened that day? How did you get out of the plane?
Well, we were lucky in one way. We had already bombed the target, and we were well on our way back to England, and we were 20 minutes from the nearest land when we got hit. So the ball turret was it was the most difficult position to make an escape from. And that really saved my life because I had ample time to get out of the turret and be ready to bail out, or else I wouldn't be here.
And what happened after you reached the ground? You had quite a difficult experience during your initial interrogation by the Germans.
Yes. Well, in the first place, our pilot was killed, and you were asking about the interrogation. It was the most brutal thing that you could imagine. You were in a great big room with about 500 other prisoners, all waiting their turn to be interrogated. And in the background, you could hear all kind of horrible sounds of being beaten, people crying out in pain, and even an occasional rifle shot. And when the interrogator came to me, I refused to give my name, except my name, rank, and serial. And he beat the heck out of me, trying to get more information. And I found out later if I would have given even the least bit of information, he would have beaten me to a pulp, trying to get more.
And you had showed me a photo earlier. You guys were in pretty bad shape by the end of your time in captivity. Tell me about the toll that took on you.
Well, we were starved to death, froze to death, and when I was shot down, I weighed 185 pounds. When I was liberated, I weighed 93.
Thank you, Lester. On the far side here is Jim Rasmussen. Jim also served in the 100th Bomb Group at a different period of the war from John Luckadoo. Jim, you were a navigator.
Yes, that's right.
We've talked about what mission stood out in your mind, and you said your scariest memory was on the Berlin mission in February ~45. It was one of the largest missions the 100th was ever on, where you all hit the heart of Berlin. What happened that day, Jim?
Well, of course, we were flying in a formation, and the target was, I can't remember specifically what it was in Berlin, but there were surprisingly several different manufacturing outfits that were in the suburbs of Berlin. So we were targeted for one of those. And it was, we had been receiving anti-aircraft fire on every mission we'd been on previously. Had lost engines, and one of the crewmen had been injured one time. But on this mission, it seemed to me that the anti-aircraft the whole battery of anti-aircraft had zeroed in on our squadron, because when the airplane right next to me, it struck me as like the whole thing kind of burst into flames. And talk about, I had never really been frightened before, and when I saw that happen to the plane, I just practically froze in fear, and that plane just kind of peeled off right over the top of us, just a flaming arrow just going over the top of us and rolled out. The plane that had been right adjacent to it had also been damaged, but it just slowly left the formation. And one of the things that finally, when I got kind of control myself after being so frightened, was that you'd watch the other plane going down, and one of the things that was always required of us, we were supposed to always count the number of people bailing out. And I remember on this one, the other plane going down, and I had counted 4 people bailing out, and being optimistic like everybody in the service was at the time, if your plane goes down, you're not going to be killed, you're just going to parachute out and either be captured or evade the enemy. So one of the things, so when I only saw 4 coming out, I knew there had been at least 9 on board, so then we figured the other 5 had just used their parachute and landed safely. When I first got to England, they asked me what outfit I was going to be in. Somebody told me that was called the Bloody 100th. Now, the English sometimes use the term bloody, not necessarily in a derogatory sense, but as kind of a descriptive sense of something that was interesting. So, but when I first got to the base, just before we started flying, I think it was like a week before it was flying, our group had a loss of like 10 aircraft in one mission, and that gave me an idea what they meant by the Bloody 100th then. So.
Thank you, Jim. On our far left is Melvin Hurwitz. Melvin arrived as a radio operator with the 493rd Bomb Group. He arrived in England during the final stages of the war. And one interesting mission that I'm very thankful that Masters of the Air does feature is what they call the Operation Chowhound missions. These guys who were flying in the later stages of the war flew so many difficult combat missions, and one point of relief for them at the end was they got to take part in some humanitarian missions. And Melvin, when you and I spoke, you said those humanitarian missions just meant the world to you, that you had been able to take part in that. Tell us what happened on Operation Chowhound and the other humanitarian mission you flew.
Thank you, Matt. First, let me say how flattered and honored I am to be sitting up here with these gentlemen. I came into the war at the later stages, and I was blessed with some safety factors that they never went through. I flew 4 combat missions and 2 Chowhound missions and 2 repatriation missions. The Chowhound missions that Matt mentioned were missions we dropped food to the starving Dutch and the Belgians and Netherlands. General Beadle Smith and Eisenhower and the American command knew that the Dutch were starving, and they stocked tons and tons of food ready to be dropped when the war ended. And a week before the war ended, they did have a truce with the Germans not to shoot at us. We loaded the bomb bays with food. We flew into Holland. I flew missions into Haarlem and Rotterdam. We flew as low as 300 feet and dropped the food to the Dutch. They were so grateful. One moment in Haarlem, we looked out the window, and there was a large field, maybe 4 or 5 acres in size, and the flowers and tulips made a sign saying, "Thank you, Yanks." And being a young kid away from home and not being involved in actual eye contact with any of the enemy, it was the first time that we saw some mode of expression from live people on the ground. Very moving, and to this day I remember it so well. After the movie actress Audrey Hepburn suffered the maladies and the nutrition from the Dutch that followed her for the rest of her life, and she was a recipient of some of the food that we dropped. The other 2 missions that Matt mentioned were After that, we flew. The war was over. We took all of our armament out. We stripped the B-17 of most everything. And we flew into Linz, Austria. My first look at the Danube, and somebody read about it in high school, but never thought I'd dream to see the Danube. And we flew into Linz, and we picked up French prisoners of war that were prisoners of the Germans for I don't know how many years. They were skin and bones and emaciated, just like you would see in the movies. We couldn't contact them. They didn't speak English. We didn't speak French. And they were frightened, but we stripped them off their clothes, which were mostly rags. We put the clothes into bonfires. We burned them. We deloused them with some sort of a white powder, and each one got a nice warm blanket. We wrapped them in the blanket, and we lined them up in the fuselage of the B-17s on either side, and probably had between 30 or 40 prisoners. We flew them from Linz, Austria, back to Chantilly, France, and we made 2 trips. And the one night that we slept over in France, they had a big carnival, and of course the young kids were heroes. And I learned my first French words language, trois vins blancs, 3 white wines for me and my 2 buddies. And they were heady times for a young kid who had never been away from home. One other mission I'd like to mention that was iconic for me is the Germans had a pocket resistance in Rian, France. And approximately 50,000 soldiers there. They would not give up. The Allies let them stay because they were too busy going inland and winning the war. But then I think it was in April or May of 45, they decided that the Germans, of course, was going to leave. The war was about to be over. And they still refused to give in. So my flight and our group were the first ones in World War II to use napalm as a bomb deterrent. And we dropped napalm onto the pocket in Rian, and then bombers came behind us and set them on fire. And the first day, they did not give up. But the second day, we did the same thing, and they surrendered. Interesting story on that is the bombardier called me over. He said, "Hey, Sparky," they called me Sparky, I was a radio operator. He said, "Sparky, you want to see something?" And I looked down and I saw these bundles of tubular pipes dropping down, and that was the napalm. And he had never seen it either, and that's why he asked me if I wanted to look. So that was quite a heady arrangement too, and that was right before the war ended. So I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to everyone who's been so nice to me, and I'm so proud to be with these gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melvin. I want to touch on a little bit kind of how the war experience ended for these gentlemen. Lucky, I mentioned before, you were one of the lucky few that finished 25 missions. Tell me about the sense of relief you had in 1944 when you finished that 25th mission.
Well, it was absolutely incredible. The loss rate of the Bloody Hundredth in the first 90 days was 86% of our air crews were lost in the first 90 days of combat. Our ability to, or our chances of surviving 25 missions were virtually nil. In reality, if a crew got through 8 missions, they were on borrowed time. And consequently, we had the problem immediately in flying a combat tour of wrestling with our conscience about how in the world we were going to psych ourselves up to get back in that airplane the next day after being badly mauled the day before, and knowing that we had to go back to the same targets because our bombing accuracy was so dismal. We had a standing order of engagement that unless our bombardier could actually visually identify the target, we weren't allowed to bomb. We had to go to a secondary target. If that was closed, then we had to bring the bombs back to the channel and drop them in the channel rather than trying to land with them was too dangerous. So as I went through my combat tour, I went originally as a co-pilot. They had taken 40 of my classmates and me directly out of advanced flying school, never having been in a B-17, and replaced all of the co-pilots. Unfortunately, this didn't happen to any other group in the 8th Air Force during World War II. Nobody knows who ordered that, or why it was ordered, or why in the world it was done, but we were stuck in the second seat, or the right seat, as second in command of a 10-man crew with no experience or familiarity with a B-17 and sent to combat. That's military intelligence for you, right? But unfortunately, that was not one of the things that was revealed in the series of Masters of the Air. That was just one of the things that happened to the 100th that didn't happen to any other group.
Lucky, let me hold you there for just a moment so we can get to everyone else before we run out of time. Lester, when the war ended for you, tell me what that Liberation Day was like.
We were actually so far gone that when we were liberated, it took quite some time to even realize that we were again free. But once it sunk in, it's indescribable.
I imagine it had to be a welcome sight when, you guys did realize indeed that you had been liberated and you were free after all that time.
Yes, but we were liberated by outposts of British, and they were chasing Germans, so they couldn't accompany us. We were supposed to walk about 21 kilometers to the nearest base. And for some reason, when we were walking, we came upon quite a few dead German soldiers. And for some reason, I picked up one of the rifles and kept on walking. And we came to a farmhouse, and I saw a couple horses out in the pasture, not by the barn. And I said to my crewman, I said, I want to see if we can't get those horses. We're just too weak to walk. And I knocked on the door, and a woman answered it, and she said, "Oh, please don't hurt me. I'm a Polish prisoner here, helping the German." And I assured her that we wouldn't harm her in any way. I said I wanted to see the master of the house. When he appeared, I pointed my gun at him and I said, I want your horses. Oh, no, 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 they're lame. You can't have them. And I said, we're taking your horses if you like it or not. He finally said, well, what do you want my horses? And I explained to him that we had to go to this base. And he said, well, what if I start at my tractor and take you that way instead? I said, that'll be just fine. He readied the tractor, and on the way, we passed a bunch of stragglers. I made him pick up every one of the stragglers on the way. And when he finally got to our destination, I thanked him and sent him back home.
Thank you, Lester. Jim Rasmussen, you were at Thorpe Abbott's, that was your base. You were there on VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. What was the jubilation like on VE Day when you learned the war in Europe was over?
Well, of course, when they declared the war being over and whatnot, they kind of locked the gate and wouldn't let us off the base anymore. So I know some of the guys that had already gotten off the base, they said they had quite a celebration in town or happened to be in London and whatnot. But on the base, in every aircraft they had what was called the Berry pistol, which was a pistol that shot a flare in the air to signal. It was either red or white or yellow, depending on what the condition was. But I remember every Berry pistol that was on the base, somebody had gotten a hold of it, and they were firing these flares all over. And of course, right, not just up in the air, but shooting at each other with these. I remember somebody in the barracks I was in. There was a barracks straight across the kind of a circle in the road there, and they were trying to shoot the flares into the doorway of this other barracks over there, and
Burn the place down.
right. So anyway, so there was a limited amount of celebration on, if you call that a limited amount, yes. So, and of course they only had the bars open for a short time. Maybe they ran out of whiskey and drink and whatnot. One thing in England, of course, you couldn't get whiskey. All you could get was Scotch, and I hated Scotch, so I never drank much whiskey over there. So,
But I know that was a celebratory day, especially for the guys who had flown so many difficult missions.
Right.
Thank you, Jim.
But those flares, that could have killed somebody.
well, sure they did, and
or it could have started the fire.
yeah,
Those things were dangerous.
I don't recall that there was anything that happened dangerously there, but I know there was a lot of flares going off.
Boys will be boys, I guess.
Right, yeah.
Melvin, I want to ask you, when did you find out that you were going back home at the end of the war?
We were in England when the war ended. I don't remember exactly when, but it wasn't long. We flew back. We flew over and we flew back. I had an experience after watching the television series Masters of the Air. So many things, or many things happened to me that I didn't remember until I saw it on television. And it triggered something in my mind that I didn't realize. I remember every stop we made going over to England, Goose Bay, Gander, Newfoundland, Greenland. But I have no memory whatsoever of coming back home. The only thing I remember is landing in Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And I learned something about the mind. I saw on Masters of the Air the flares flying into the air when the end of the war came, and I hadn't remembered that, but the minute I saw it, it all came back to me.
It's incredible how something like that can spark a memory.
The mind is a funny thing.
Indeed.
But,
Thank you, Melvin.
but we were in England, the war ended. I remember seeing the farm folk dancing around the little haystacks, the men and the women. We were on, our air bases were on farms, and we were out in the middle of nowhere. And they were dancing around haystacks and singing a little British naughty ditty at the time, Knees Up, Mother Brown. Knees up, don't get the breeze up, knees up, Mother Brown. And they were singing this song. And now whenever I meet someone of a certain age, I said, you remember Knees Up, Mother Brown? Oh, yes. Know all about it.
Thank
you. Things like that I remember, but certain things I have no memory.
It's interesting when you think about where the 8th Air Force was at. As Melvin mentioned, the 8th Air Force bases in England were on farmland. Many of these were leased farmlands.
Right.
So the British people nearby got to know these guys, kind of adopted a crew, so to speak. So, it was, I don't say traumatic, but it was a huge thing for the British people who, loved these guys so much, and to now see their boys going home. They were happy for the war to end, but sad to see
The British
boys
were
going
wonderful.
home. Yes.
The British were marvelous. They had a step up a lip, like they say. They carried through, and they treated us as nicely as they could.
Indeed. I think we have time for a question or two. If anyone has a question for these gentlemen, let's see if we can get to one of the cadets here.
Hold on just a second, let's get some mics. We got mics coming up, we'll start here.
Hello, gentlemen. I'm Cadet Bernardin from Virginia Tech. My question is for Lucky. You mentioned one of your 4 enemies was fear. I just want to know, how did you and your crew motivate yourselves to push through that fear on your 25 missions, knowing the risk you faced on each one of them?
I don't know if you caught that he said, talking about the fear, how did you, knowing what you were up against, how did you, motivate yourself? How did your crew motivate themselves to push forward despite that fear?
Well, it's a very good question, and I have to tell you, I don't know. We just had to reach deep down inside to our basic core and say, look, you're here to do a job. Now, in combat, it's very strange. When a crew goes down, they're just gone. You never have a memorial service or a funeral service. You just gather up their effects and ship them home. And you get back in that airplane the next day and go out and do the same thing. We knew we had a job to do, and we thought we were doing the right thing. And I didn't get to answer Matt's question about what it feels like to finish up 25, to finish up a tour. And I can tell you that it's just the end of the world. I got down and kissed the ground, and thank God that I had been fortunate enough to have survived 25 missions, particularly with the Bloody 100th Bomb Group.
Thank you.
And you had to have a guardian angel on both shoulders, or you wouldn't have survived.
We have a question up here.
Good morning, gentlemen. Midshipman First Class Tom Johnson from the United States Naval Academy. My question is also for Lucky. You mentioned you had no time in the B-17 and your flight training was cut short. My question for you is, what were your thoughts and feelings as you walked to the B-17 for the first time, and what did your flight training end up looking like?
Well, you had mentioned that they had replaced all the co-pilots, and here you are seeing a B-17 for the first time. What was that like to see the Flying Fortress in person for the first time?
Sheer terror. You were flying a 4-engine airplane you'd never been in before, with a crew that you were totally unfamiliar with, and it was grossly unfair if you want to stop and think about it. to have done that, and nobody knows why they did. And I have to tell you that of that 40 of us, 4 finished the combat tour. Only 10%. So that proved that the strategy and the policy was not that sound, and they never did it to another group.